Thank you, Amadi, for the, very generous intro. And thank you, UKPHA, everybody else who's involved. I know there's a team involved in this. You guys are doing a lot of hard work, even while, going to work during this crazy time of the pandemic. Um, it's really an honor and it's really a privilege that, you've parsed out time for, somebody like me who's still a student to be included with, such, amazing authors that have come before me and that are going to come after me. So, I really do want to say that, honestly, this is an honor and a privilege to come speak about the podcast and more generally the Suraj Prakash, from which the podcast is based. So you mentioned that, there's a Suraj podcast. Essentially what that is a chapter by chapter summary of this text called the Suraj Prakash. It's a pre-colonial text. It finished in 1843. I'm going to get to that text, show you a little bit about the history, the context, where it comes from, and why it's important nowadays. So, for my talk, I kind of want to turn back the dial a little bit from the previous conversation. So Philip talked about, a modern day issue. Kavta Puri spoke about, the devastating effects of partition, the end of the British Raj in India. Kim Wagner talked about, a tragedy that happened in the British Raj. But now I just want to turn back, the time a little bit for when the Raj was not fully established in India, just before the British come into the area of Punjab, to a time when Punjab was ruled by, people like Ranjit Singh out of Lahore. You had Karam Singh in Patiala, Uday Singh in Kathal. This was a time, from the early 19th century where there was an explosion of investment into institutions, funded by these monarchs. So gurdwaras were being constructed in the memory of the gurus. Ranjit Singh was, funding, the installation of the gold on Harmandir Sahib that we all know. Significant land grants were being, and patronage was being allocated to institutions, different bungas. A bunga is a teaching institution, or other groups like the Nirmalas and Udasis. All of these groups were receiving very gracious patronage during that time. And it was during that time that Santokh Singh, the author of this text, the Suraj Prakash, that he was composing his magnum opus, the Suraj Prakash, which is a gigantic text, very important historical text, which covers the lives of the 10 Sikh gurus. So a little bit about the author, Santokh Singh, often called the Mahakavi, the great poet, for writing such an extensive amount of work, and his, poetic genius as well. He was born in the late 18th century, so 1788, in the western part of Punjab. He belonged to the Shipa caste, a cloth making caste. His mom's name was Ram Devi. His father, Jvala Singh, was well versed in Gurbani, Sikh scripture. And, that's where Santokh Singh got a lot of his early learning from, mainly his father. But his father, upon seeing, the talent, the capabilities of a young Santokh Singh, he then decides to take him to Amritsar to entrust him under the tutelage of, one Sant Singh Gyani, who is the main teacher at the Gyaniya Bunga, the institution for producing Gyanis, or scholars on Sikh scripture. I'll speak a little bit about that institution in a second. But it should be noted that, Amritsar during that time, out of all places, was the center, the core, the heart of the Sikh tradition, during that time. It was guarded and maintained by the Akalis who were residing in the Akal Takat. And many different institutions flourished in and outside of the complex. So not only, institutions like the Gyaniya Bunga, who focused more on scripture, but also music institutions, different Qaranas would be housed in the complex as well. So here we have actually, this comes from the Golden Temple of Amritsar, Reflections of the Past, a book by Kashias. Here we can see, if you look at the bottom right, number 47 that's highlighted, that is where the Gyaniya Bunga would be. And unfortunately, a lot of these other numbers that I referenced there, other institutions, since have ceased to exist. So um, it's a very valuable book. It shows, where the Gyaniya Bunga would be, basically at the footsteps of the Akal Takat. So as I mentioned, Deva Singh entrusted a young Santokh Singh to the Gyaniya Bunga, where he would then formally begin his study of Sanskrit as well as Braj Pasha. So here is a image showing the lineage of the Gyaniya Bunga, an institution that lost importance and prominence in the latter part of the 19th century. But a little bit about Braj Pasha as well, one of the languages that Santokh Singh was learning there. During that time, Braj Pasha was the poetic language at the time for the Sikhs. We can say this because the majority of Sikh historical works prior to that in the 18th century were mainly written in Braj. This begins to change at the end of the 19th century, which also I'll speak to later on in the talk. So actually this lineage and this image here is provided from Professor Harjot Oberoy's Construction of Religious Boundaries book. But about Sant Singh, the Gyani, the main teacher at the Gyaniya Bunga during that time, he was extremely well known. In fact, in Amritsar, if anybody was going to speak about Sikh scripture or spirituality, they were going to be speaking about Sant Singh. So on the screen here, we have a quote from a very important text written by Ganesha Das in 1847. This text, Char Bagh Punjab, is a very interesting, very useful, important text. It gives a detailed account of Punjab, divided up into the various regions of Punjab. He speaks of all things from religious sites to festivals to customs, traditions of those respective areas. So when speaking specifically about Amritsar, he mentions, there's sadhus, there's saints in this area. He mentions them by name. But then when speaking about, interpreters of Sikh scripture, one name stands among all of them, and that's Sant Singh. Here he says, Sant Singh was famous for his understanding of the Granth, which is an extremely, high position to hold and to come from. As we said, Amritsar during that time was the hub of, Sikh scriptural knowledge and just even religious culture. So this quote actually, Jvala Singh Punjab, this text can be found from J.S. Grewal's book, early 19th century Punjab. J.S. Grewal and Indu Banga have translated this text, this Persian text, into English and provided commentary, footnotes. Like I said, this is a very important text to help us understand the cultural, social, religious landscape of Punjab during Ranjit Singh's kingdom. So below that quote, we have another quote from an important book by J.W. Leitner. So History of Indigenous Education in Punjab Since Annexation. This was written in 1882. Very important survey of Punjab, documenting the education style, systems, institutions of the time since annexation. Obviously, Sant Singh comes a little bit after that, a little bit before that, but even during Leitner's time, he's still worth mentioning. Something still worth mentioning. He talks about how Sant Singh was not only a teacher, but also a poet. And currently there's no work, there's no big studies that have been done on Sant Singh's writings, but he did write a Braj version of the Ramachartmanas, the story of Rama. This was originally written by Tulsidas in the early 19th century in Awadhi. So bringing it back to Santokh Singh, just a little bit further about Sant Singh. Sant Singh was not only, a scriptural authority, but, he was an extremely important figure in Ranjit Singh's kingdom as well, in regard to the management of Darbar Sahib. So to this day, this can be seen. So this image here is of one of the four doors of Harmandir Sahib. I believe this is on the left-hand side. And we'll just zoom in a little bit here. So this is above the door on Harmandir Sahib. It commemorates Sant Singh's overseeing of the refurbishing, the work done by or paid for by Ranjit Singh. So here it even says, the third line down, see him, Sri Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji So Karai. So, this has been done by Ranjit Singh, this seva, this refurbishing, modified through Sri by Sant Singh Gyani Ji Ki. So Sant Singh was overseeing and managing all the work that Ranjit Singh was doing, from putting the gold on the Darbar Sahib, as well as other refurbishings of the area. So Sant Singh is quite literally edged into the heart of the Sikh tradition, and has been immortalized. A little bit of a sadder image, I guess, that shows kind of the loss of heritage over time. But if we can see that there's a small building in this image in front of the tower there, the tower being Baba Atal Gurdwara, that small building is the Samad, or the building of remembrance for Sant Singh, which was constructed when he passed away. So the building no longer remains. It was destroyed during some renovations during the late 19th century. So all of that to say that Sant Singh was, at the heart and core of the Sikh world, and it is from that core, this established institution of the Ganya Bunga, this amazing scholar and poet, administrator Sant Singh, that Santokh Singh receives his learning from, his education. So after Santokh Singh leaves his esteemed teacher, spending about 8-9 years there, he bounces around a little. He spent some time in Banaras, apparently up to 4 years before coming back to the city of Buri in Punjab. And it is there that he starts to write his first works. So the first work he writes is a Nam Kosh, which is a dictionary, a Sanskrit dictionary into Braj words. He also writes, as the screen shows here, the Nanak Prakash. This is a folio of Nanak Prakash. The Nanak Prakash being the stories of Guru Nanak. And this would essentially become the first section of the Suraj Prakash, when it's all done. So this begins in 1821, and he finishes this in 1824 in the city of Amritsar. He's 36 when he finishes this text. Not too much is known about Santokh Singh's early patronage, but at some point he does fall under the patronage of Karam Singh of Patiala estate. So this is an image from Tazkirat al-Umra of Colonel James Skinner. This is text 1836, paintings of the royal tea around Punjab. So you have Karam Singh here. I do want to thank Devinder Singh Toor for providing me this image. So Santokh Singh does spend some time under Karam Singh, where he writes some of his works. So after some time, because of the word being spread about his Nanak Prakash, he gets called down to a small city-state of Kathal, which is south of Patiala. So it was here that he would receive very gracious patronage from the king there, the Raja Uday Singh. So this is another image from the same text. And this is displaying Uday Singh. So this state of Kathal was carved out during a missile period by Uday Singh's grandfather, Desu Singh. He carves this out in 1767. And that family traces their lineage back to a famous Sikh of Guru Arjan named Bhagtu. So this city-state ends up folding up into the British control upon Uday Singh's death in 1843, which is something I'll touch on later as well. So it was here in Kathal, under this gracious patronage of Uday Singh, that Santokh Singh then writes the 4 remaining works of his. He writes a commentary on Guru Nanak's Japji called the Garbganjani Tika. He writes a Braj version of a Sanskrit text called the Atma Puran. This is, a text dealing with metaphysics. He writes a Braj version of the Sanskrit Valmiki Ramayana, and he would conclude with his magnum opus, the Suraj Prakash. So the Suraj Prakash then follows up on the Nanak Prakash and writes the stories of the remaining gurus from Guru Angad, the second guru, to Guru Gobind Singh. So the full title of the text, Gur Pratap Suraj Prakash Granth, meaning the sun-like illumination of the Guru's glory, is meant to analogize the sun's illuminating rays with the glory of the Guru. And it's this idea that then manifests into the organization of the text. So the text is organized in 4 sections of it. The first section relating to Guru Nanak is sunrise to sunset. It's divided in 2 sections. And then the second section deals with the lives of the second Guru to the 9th Guru. And these are organized in what's called in Sanskrit Rashi, in Punjabi Ras, and in English Zodiac. So the idea is that an individual observing this illumination of the sun is first going to experience the micro, the sunrise and the sunset. And then from there, if we watch the sky just before sunrise, we will see a set of constellations that appear to have a pattern for about a month before they change. Each month then is represented by a set of constellations, and that's what we call then a zodiac. So this is called a sidereal method of measuring a year, divided in 12 spaces. So you have these 12 zodiacs, these 12 Ras, and that's covering, the life of Guru Angad up to Guru Tegh Bahadur. And then following that experience, you have the coming of different seasons. So in India, they think of seasons of having, they think of 6 seasons there instead of 4 seasons. And, that would be represented as basically 2 months per season. So here we are dealing with the stories of Guru Gobind Singh. But Guru Gobind Singh's stories are so vast and so big that they then spill over into what is called the solstices. So 2 solstices. One solstice would be the winter solstice. So that's the angular decline of the sun in the sky, which takes 6 months from June to December. And then the last component of the Suraj Prakash, the summer solstice, the ever-increasing daylight day by day from December to June. So essentially the organization is a sophisticated map of the micro to the macro illumination of the sun. It goes from half a day, sunrise, sunset, and then it goes to a month through the zodiac, 30 days, then it goes to the season, 2 months, and then it goes into an an. An an is an solstice, 6 months. So Santokh Singh in his writings also explains why he's even writing this. His desire to write it. In the first Ras, he mentions this, that the history of the gurus in the world is not bound all together in one spot. And basically he's going to extract all the history that has come before it and compile it all together in one large text. And this is going to make sense if we begin to look at the texts that preceded, that come in the 18th century. So when we look at the major Sikh historical texts that come in the 18th century, obviously, not every single one, but these are the ones that have any substantial size. So you have Gur Soba, written by Sena Singh, 1711. So Gur Soba deals with the life of Guru Gobind Singh. You have Guru Bilas Bachai Chemi, 1719, that deals with the life of the 6th Guru. You have another text dealing with Guru Gobind Singh's life, Guru Bilas Bachai Dasmi, Kaur Singh in 1751. You have Bansavali Nama, Kesa Singh Shibbar, 1769, Mehima Prakash, 1776, Guru Bilas Bachai Dasmi, Sukha Singh. Again, this one is only speaking to Guru Gobind Singh's stories in 1797. So out of all of these, only Bansavali Nama and Mehima Prakash include the stories of all the gurus, first guru to the last. But they are quite minuscule in size when we compare them to Suraj Prakash, thus the need to write a full history of all the gurus. So, just as an example, Bansavali Nama is about 2,500 verses. And if we compare that, put that beside Suraj Prakash, a whopping 60,000 verses. In fact, you could take Suraj Prakash and you could add up all the historical texts from the 18th century and it still would not even come close to the size of Suraj Prakash. It's quite vast. So then we can say, on what did Santokh Singh base his writings on? So the majority of the writing of the Suraj Prakash, according to Santokh Singh, is derived from these stories written down by Aram Kaur and his associates. So Ram Kaur Santokh was, a famed Sikh who, after taking initiation at the hands of Guru Gobind Singh, came to be known as Guru Baksh Singh. Ram Kaur's lineage goes back to Baba Buddha, whose long life would have enabled him to live through the Gurus. An extensive portion of Viras number 1, the first zodiac, focusing on praise of Baba Buddha, anchoring Ram Kaur to Baba Buddha. So Ram Kaur spent an extensively long time with Guru Gobind Singh, and also being a descendant of Baba Buddha was thus perhaps assumed to have inherited these stories of the previous gurus. And he was thus requested at that time, this is likely early 18th century, so early 1700s, to expound upon the life history of the gurus. And this history was then written down by a scribe staying with Ram Kaur. His name was Sahib Singh. And these collection of stories, which have been called the Panj So Sakhi, find their way eventually to Santokh Singh while residing in Kathol, and they become his primary source. Now, I didn't include the Panj So Sakhi in the previous slide because currently we don't have any manuscripts of the Panj So Sakhi. In the writings of Gyani Gyan Singh, Gyani Gyan Singh is an important historical figure from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He writes a lot of historical texts as well, coming, some 50 years after Santokh Singh. He writes that he has seen this text, the Panj So Sakhi. He confirms that it did exist at some point. But then when Bir Singh, another very important Sikh historical figure, in the early 20th century, he publishes the Suraj Prakash. He mentions that he has not been able to locate the source, this Panj So Sakhi, from which Santokh Singh derived his work from. So, while Santokh Singh used the Panj So Sakhi of Ram Kaur, these now inaccessible, unknown sources, stories, he also mentions that he does use other sources as well. He says the writings of Mani Singh, by Mani Singh, who's said to have written the Sikhani Bhagatmala, an anthology of stories relating to the Sikh gurus. It's also possible that Santokh Singh used other Gurubala sources, such as Gurubala Pachahi Chemi, whose author Bhagat Singh says that these stories came from Mani Singh. So in addition to Ram Kaur and Mani Singh's writings, Santokh Singh mentions how he did travel extensively throughout Punjab, picking up stories wherever he could, and then, relaying that in his work. So Santokh Singh ends up completing this vast work in 1843. This is the same year that Uday Singh of Kathol passes away. Following the passing of Uday Singh, like I mentioned before, the state of Kathol, which Santokh Singh is residing in, that falls into the hands of the British. And this is actually very interesting. That's how Santokh Singh actually signs off on the text at the end. He says that, the British now have entered the city of Kathol. They have plundered and they have beat everybody, including sadhus, holy people in religious sites. He does say that because of the Guru's grace, not one hair on his head has been bent. So he's saying like he's doing well. But, this is essentially how Santokh Singh ends his work. But it leaves us with a big mystery because, he ends up passing away shortly after that. And there doesn't appear to be much information as to how he does pass away. So oral tradition states that Santokh Singh, after completing this text, Santokh Singh then makes his way back to Amritsar to donate this text to the Gyaniya Bunga, and he makes a prayer in front of the Akal Takat that the Sangat, the congregation, should utilize this text. At which point, from the Akal Takat, they mandate that this beautiful and lengthy text to be read in all Sikh institutions daily. And this is a tradition that still some of the Takat Hazur Sahib in Nandir and Takat Patna Sahib and Bahar, they carry on this tradition. You know, whether that story actually occurred, that requires whether that claim requires more research. But we do know from historical writings, which I'm going to get into, that Santokh Singh's works soon after were very widely received. And here we have a quote back to Leitner, an important work on education systems in Punjab. So soon after he mentions Sant Singh, he brings up again Santokh Singh, saying that Santokh Singh has rendered his name immortal, and this Suraj Prakash. What's interesting here is he talks about how the Suraj Prakash is being translated into Urdu at this time in 1882. We're not sure if that translation had been completed. That's something for further research to uncover. What's really interesting about this quote is he says, this text, the Suraj Prakash, is yet to receive the admiration of European scholars. And if we look at it, this is written maybe some 140 years ago that Leitner was writing this. And still to this day, the Suraj Prakash has not really seriously, in any great length, received serious study in Western academia. So what we do know, what's important about this is that, Leitner was writing this in the late 1800s. And we know that during this time, from the work of Professor Hajrot Oberoi, a very important work, Construction of Religious Boundaries, that this time was very conflicted. Late 19th century, either early 20th century, there was a split amongst the community. So you had two Singh Sabhas, with different ideas about the Sikh tradition in respect to perhaps how it fit in with the wider Indian or Hindu world. You had the Amritsar Singh Sabha, and you had the Lahore Singh Sabha. And both of these, what's interesting is both of these sides, Amritsar and Lahore, both of them promoted the Suraj Prakash. So if we come now to the Amritsar side of the Singh Sabha, Sumer Singh, whose photo is here, Sumer Singh was the chairman of the Faridkot Tika program, where the Faridkot Tika was essentially many people in the Amritsar Singh Sabha had endeavored to create a commentary of Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scripture, to provide meanings of it. This becomes the first full commentary of Guru Granth Sahib. And they did this because they thought that some of these oral traditions, these meanings of the scripture, were being lost over time and being replaced by new thought that was coming in. So Sumer Singh definitely represents the old school, the Amritsar Singh Sabha thought at that time. And he was one of their representatives. Sumer Singh was also the Takat Patna Sahib Jathedar. Beyond that, just a little aside about Sumer Singh, he was one of the most renowned Braj poets as well, even outside of the Sikh world. So something I'll get to later in the talk as well, when the decline of Braj happens in the late 19th century, early 20th century, people across communities, not only the Sikh community, begin to stop using Braj, but there has been Western academic work on the last Braj poet. And the last Braj poet, who was not a Sikh, happened to learn from Sumer Singh. So people were sending poetic students to Sumer Singh to learn how to write Braj. And Sumer Singh was an extensive Braj poet, also a historian. So he has written in one of his works, the Gurpad Prem Prakash. This work is essentially the life story of Guru Gobind Singh. And in it, at the end of it, he does speak about the other sources that he draws from. In fact, he mentions basically the list that I provided earlier. I have the book here. He mentions, Sana Singh's works. He mentions, so Sana Singh wrote Gursoba. He mentions the works attributed to Mani Singh, Sikhandi Bhagtmala, and those lot. He mentions Kesar Singh Shibar's work, Bansavli Nama. He mentions Swarup Chand, the Mehma Prakash. He mentions by Sukha Singh's Gurublas Pasha Dasmi. He mentions all of these works. And then at the end of it, he has this praise for Santokh Singh that, there's no other text like Suraj Prakash. This is basically the crown jewel of text in terms of history. And throughout his book, the Gurpad Prem Prakash, he'll often mention that, okay, I'm telling this story. This is my summarized version of the text that you can see in the Suraj Prakash. Heavy praise laid on Santokh Singh. And so that represents one side of the camps that were formed during that time. On the other side, you had the Lahore Singh Sabha. This was led by scholars like Veer Singh shown in this photo here. They also utilized Suraj Prakash. Much of Veer Singh's works, he writes like Guru Nanak Chamatkar, Kalgita Chamatkar. These are historical writings. He's telling stories of the Guru. And much of that is derived from the Suraj Prakash. Obviously, there's summarized versions. But so he's basically revamping Suraj Prakash for a modern audience of that time. He's writing largely in Punjabi during that time. This is when he's writing in the early 20th century. This is when the decline of Braj is happening. And yet is Veer Singh that publishes the Suraj Prakash with extensive footnotes and commentary. So he doesn't provide a full commentary, doesn't provide a full translation into Punjabi, but it shows how Braj was in the decline because previous publications of the Suraj Prakash did not have footnotes. A lot of that vocabulary was known to readers. When Veer Singh's publishing it for the first time in 1927, and then again in the second time with some revisions in 1935, which is largely what people read today, which is largely what they look at today, he's putting footnotes in there to say, okay, this word means this. And he's explaining a lot because of that loss of language that happens during that time. And which is really important to know just generally about why perhaps some history is lost because of language difficulties. People didn't have access, even during that time, to what exactly Santokh Singh was writing about in his Suraj Prakash. This takes us into this idea about language politics. The late 19th century and the early 20th century marked a point of decline of Braj Bhasha. So this was not an isolated occurrence in Punjab. This was occurring around India. So this was as a result of the politics of religious and cultural identity. The late Alison Bush wrote a beautiful work about Braj, Poetry of Kings, a must-read for anybody looking into anything Braj related. And as a point of example, I've included a photo here of Gyani Gyan Singh. Now, Gyani Gyan Singh is somebody of really significant importance. He comes into the scene around the late 19th century. He begins writing then in Braj Bhasha. He actually reworks some of Ratan Singh Pangu's writings into Braj Bhasha. So he's taking older texts and writing it in a more sophisticated Braj Bhasha in 1880 when he writes the Naveen Pant Prakash, because he thinks that Ratan Singh, who wrote earlier, some 50, 60 years earlier, didn't do a good job writing in poetry. So, you can see that during that time, Braj was in the vogue. And, some 30, 40 years later, in Gyan Singh's writings, he totally changes. Because of the politics of that time, he's no longer writing in Braj, but he shifts into Punjabi. And that is a result, like I was saying, of the changing politics of that time. So largely the Braj texts from before do not get utilized. And that then translates us into today's age when, the text like Suraj Prakash is largely inaccessible. So even if somebody was reading this in a Gurdwara today, fluent Punjabi speakers would probably not have a good idea about what the text is saying. Thus, if we see, and people can, watch videos online of Suraj Prakash, Katha of discourse of the text in Punjabi. They will have somebody reading the text and then somebody beside them explaining the text in Punjabi. And this is how the transmission then from the early 20th century would carry on of this text. So this text would be taught in traditional learning institutions. The Taksals, like Damdami Taksal, still teaches it to this day. The Nirmalas, they teach it to this day. The Udasis utilize this text. Various Nahang groups are using this text as well. But it does require significant study, even for somebody who's proficient in Punjabi to grasp. And it's because of that inaccessibility, people have started writing commentaries of Suraj Prakash. There's one by Ajit Singh Olak in Punjabi. So he goes through the whole text. It's a very large work and must have required significant effort. His Punjabi at times is quite accurate to what the text is saying, but at other times it's quite problematic where he will censor a lot of what's happening in the text. So for example, there are portions where Jeevanpal Singh had pointed this out, who was part of the Bhai Gurdas Education Trust, that when Ajit Singh Olak is writing his commentary of Nanak Prakash, the first section is relating to Guru Nanak, he'll clip out portions that he thinks the Guru may not have said. So there, in this text, what will happen is the Guru often will quote Gurbani, and he'll explain the context of that quote in Gurbani. And Olak, if that line is not found in the modern day printed version of Guru Granth Sahib, he'll just snip it out, with not even a mention that he's snipping portions out. Other times, Olak will have the line there. He won't snip the line out, but he'll put underneath it that, I'm not going to translate this line. This goes against the Guru's teachings. And another time, he will translate the line, but put a footnote to saying that, the Guru could not have said this. So even in modern translations of the text and in modern discourse that you see online on Katha, people avoid some of the some of the stories in the text because it might offend modern sensibilities or modern thoughts and the modern philosophy about what maybe Sikhi would preach upon. So this is a problem because then those portions then get left out. And like I said before, the Suraj Prakash coming right before the British, coming into Punjab, coming from the major Sikh institution of what it was, the Gyaniya Bunga, it provides a very good example, or at least of what Sikhs thought at that time, what constituted the stories of the Sikh gurus, and even in regard to the Sikh philosophy on a whole. And nowadays people don't have that accessibility, and that's why I want to turn us to a project that I've started called the Suraj Podcast. Now, the Suraj Podcast, like I mentioned before, is basically I'm providing English summaries, chapter to chapter, of the stories of the Gurus. So I've started with the Gurus relating to Guru Hargobind, the sixth Guru, and almost daily I've been putting up one chapter at a time. They'll range in length from about 6 minutes to 15-20 minutes per episode. I try not to leave, I make sure never to leave any material fact in the story, but in a way to make it accessible, I do provide modern vernacular to explain ideas while being truthful to the text. I did want to play just the intro and maybe a minute to give those viewers, listeners, an idea about the podcast. So this is episode number 6. To those who are aware of this story, Bidli Chand, a Sikh of Guru Hargobind, ends up, infiltrating the fort of Lahore and then stealing some horses from that fort. So this is how episode 6 starts off.
welcome back to the Suraj Podcast. We are continuing on with the stories that relate to Bidhi Chand stealing horses from Lahore Fort. In the previous episode, Bidhi Chand is now fully integrated. He's infiltrated the fort of Lahore. He's gained intelligence as to where the saddles are. And chapter 30 just starts off with Bidhi Chand thinking, I have this intelligence, I'm inside, I just need the opportune time. So coincidentally then, his friends are there in the scene, the other workers who are helping him with the horses. They say to him, they say Kasera, that's his fake name. You've only been here a short amount of time, yet in the amount of time you've come here, you've shot up in the ranks. You earn more money than us. Shah Jahan's been giving you awards. You got this award for 1,000 rupees. Yet all of that, and you've never gave us anything to eat. You never gave us anything to drink. You've not taken us out. That's not right of you. There's a protocol here. And at that exact moment, Bidhi Chand's thinking, this is it. I got these guys right now. And
All right. That's where I wanted to end it. What eventually happens, I don't want to do any spoilers to those who don't know, but Bidhi Chand eventually orchestrates a plan to make them incapacitated such that he could then steal the horses. I just wanted to end off, showing that the Suraj Podcast, along with other translation work, has been supported through the Manglacharn Patreon page for those who enjoy the work, for those who want to contribute. This page helps us, produce all of this work. And with that, I'll send it back to Amandeep for questions.
Wow, that was quite something. That was a great trot through and a great introduction. And there's lots of questions that are coming up as a result of this. So let's go straight over really to questions. So the big one is actually you touched on this in a couple of places, didn't you? This idea that later Sikh scholars or later scholars then try to kind of almost clean up or somehow edit things. So this one's by V. Sikh. Can you see this on the screen, by the way, Jvala? Can you see this?
That he added footnotes to manuscripts. Sorry?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, so on the screen it says by Veer Singh added footnotes to Suraj Prakash manuscripts because some believe there are inconsistencies. Now, do you mean inconsistencies in the stories from other historical sources? The question goes on to say, having studied the scripts, how much truth would you say there is to the claim on inconsistencies? Two types of inconsistencies. I'm not sure which one you're talking about in regard to inconsistencies of the manuscripts of Santokh Singh's himself's writings. That is yet to be carefully looked at. Veer Singh himself has put this critical edition out where he says he has looked into the different manuscripts. That is yet to be, as far as I know, properly studied. In regard to inconsistencies in terms of stories, that's a claim that I think largely when Veer Singh, as far as I've come across so far, I mean, mind you, this text is gigantic, but the only footnotes that I see that he provides his objection to are largely based on philosophical disagreements. So he will say, the Guru or Sikhs could not have done this, and then he might quote a line from Gurbani, his interpretation of Gurbani, or just the mindset about a Sikh and what he could and could not do. I do not believe largely he quotes other sources to say that. Having now this process, I'm going through the stories of Guru Hargobind. I am cross-referencing sections with earlier texts such as Guru Jvala Singh. I mentioned before that covers the life story of Guru Hargobind that's written in the 18th century. And largely Santokh Singh is very accurate in regard to following previous sources, even to the extent of mentioning like Guru Jvala Singh talks about what clothing Guru Hargobind wore when he went into battle. He dressed in this white clothing. Santokh Singh's consistent in that. He even mentions that. So as far as I can see, there have been consistencies in Santokh Singh's works and previous writings.
Like, so for example, in terms of in terms of some of the historical facts that he's presented, have you done any validation of that from the story, which I appreciate is sometimes just a narrative that kind of carries on a greater meaning, but does it validate well with other sources like Mughal sources or
well, I mean, in regard to Sikh sources, absolutely, because of Guru Bilas Bachai Chimi and the other Guru Bilas literature lines up quite well. In regard to Mughal sources, specifically for those who have been listening to the podcast, they have heard these stories of Bidhi Chand. There was a traveler who actually meets Guru Hargobind in 1643, the last year of Guru Hargobind's life. And, even he, as he's writing about Guru Hargobind, contemporary writing, in a Persian source, he mentions, Bidhi Chand, there's a Sikh that's famed for stealing, he would steal from the rich and give to the poor. They would mention, how the Sikhs all knew about how Guru Hargobind fought in battle. They say, this is how he fought in battle with his sword. These are stories that we can see had importance, not to Santokh Singh only in the, in the early 19th century. This is contemporary of the time where the Sikhs are talking about even Guru Hargobind's love of this philosophy that, the world is like a dream. He meets Guru Hargobind, this traveler, and he talks about how Guru Hargobind tells people these stories about, his conception, his metaphysics of the world is such that, the world is like a dream, and he writes extensively about that. So if somebody wants to look into that source, I have it here, another J.S. Graywall book, Sikh History from Persian Sources, a must read as well, for those looking at other historical sources outside of the Sikh world. So, I mean, because of the length and the size of Santokh Singh's works, that is, the next layer of study that's going to have to go into it in terms of, validating Santokh Singh's writings with other works. But even the groundwork has yet to be done. And that groundwork, which the podcast hopes to do, is provide that foundation of stories, a catalog, a library of all the stories related to Guru Hargobind. And just to give people a sense of the size of the text, if I put up an episode every single day, it will take me this entire year to get through the stories of Guru Hargobind. That's how many stories there are just for Guru Hargobind. There's significant amounts of information that people can get through.
And in amongst that, I mean, it's phenomenal. There's this manuscript, so 60,000 verses, as you said. It was absolutely central to Sikh understanding of their history before those dastardly Brits came. And it's completely kind of forgotten now. Is there anything, I appreciate you may not have studied every single aspect of it, but are there stories within there, are there aspects of history that might actually change the common man's understanding, my kind of understanding of Sikh history? Is there something in there that deserves particular attention?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Philip mentioned this as well. It's like, we can see through these texts, we can read between the lines of what's important, what constantly gets mentioned, what is the Guru's routine, what are the other Sikhs' routine, what do they do? Those are afterthoughts in the story. It's telling a story, and then it's mentioning, okay, the Guru gets up early, he does this, he does that, other Sikhs are doing this. But those facts, that scene that Santokh Singh is painting, extremely valuable. Even to the extent that we can see a modern understanding of maybe a Guru Sikh wedding nowadays. What did that consist of? What's that consist of now? What did Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding look like? We have that information. All of that information is wild when you think about it, because then it sits in your head and you say, okay, it provides basically imagery. You can go through an event, you can go to a ceremony, and you can remember and say, oh, Guru Tegh Bahadur was doing this. I wonder how he would have reacted in this type of situation. It provides, a landscape of information surrounding the characters of the text. Like somebody yesterday, a friend of mine was saying that he was listening to the podcast. He was speaking about one of Guru Hargobind's wives, Nanaki, Mata Nanaki. And Mata Nanaki is the mother of Guru Tegh Bahadur, the grandmother of Guru Gobind Singh. and he was just blown away that, oh, it's wild that Guru Tegh Bahadur was there, and Bidhi Chand was at his wedding. So they were probably talking about all these things. Like all these ideas then sit in the listener's mind, and it creates this like landscape, this environment for which they can place then their Sikh history as well. For me, that's been a huge takeaway personally.
Okay, wonderful. There's a couple more questions on the Q&A, then I'll ask people to put their hands up. So where can you get copies of Suraj? Is it accessible? Is it accessible in English? Is there a translation that's available?
Yeah, so
take that first, next.
Where do you get copies from Suraj Prakash? What types of copies? First of all, if you're looking at the actual text with Veer Singh's footnotes, this is written in the Gurmukhi script in the language of Braj Bhasha, probably quite difficult for some, but you can access that. The website iktera, so ik13.com, I think, has put up all of the sections related to Suraj Prakash, Veer Singh's translations, his footnotes and commentary. So that's there. Currently, the only other, beyond the podcast, the only other English sources or translations of the text has been done by Bhai Gurdas Education Trust, amazing institution out of England. Jeevan Pal Singh, Resham Singh have written volume 1 of Guru Nanak stories, Guru Nanak Prakash. I'm not exactly sure what chapter they get up to, but it's a significant amount, and it's worth checking out, and it's worth supporting as well. They have been very honest in their translation as well, as in addition to providing footnotes and commentary as well. It's a great resource for those who want to look up the stories of Guru Nanak in English. Also, prior to that, there was a Kamalpreet Singh Pardesi. He started a blog, I think it's still up, 6 Scriptures to English, where he was translating as well the stories of Guru Nanak. Beyond the stories of Guru Nanak, there's nothing else in English beyond these chapter summaries that I'm providing via the Suraj Podcast. Oh, so, and like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for Punjabi commentary, Ajit Singh Olak has written a Punjabi commentary. I believe there's another one by Gyani Kirpal Singh. I'm not quite sure if that's full, but you do find Punjabi commentaries. The problem with them, like I said before, is that they expunge sections, or they mistranslate sections purposefully, or they just refuse to translate sections. So
okay, and there's a question about that. What's the kind of philosophical problems that come up where they say, well, there's no way that the Guru could have said that. There's no way that this could have happened.
I think this gets illustrated in one of my podcasts, in one of the battles, actually, in Guru Hargobind's times. It was the Battle of Guru Sar. So people can look through the podcast episode track list there. In the stories there, just before the battle happens, Guru Hargobind kind of makes a prayer, tells, basically, commands that the god of wind, Pavan Devta, come and blow cold wind upon the Mughal enemies there, Turuks. And it's this type of mythology in the text. And it should be noted that mythology during this time, in the early 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, was widespread among, historical texts. It's normal for that genre. Because it's there, it should not be thought of as superfluous. Like, a mythology has been used to convey deeper truths as well, like meta truths, maybe meta truths about the nature of the Guru that the author wants to convey. So it's those type of stories that, people like Veer Singh, other people, when they comment on the text, say, oh, the Guru would have never done this. He doesn't need to do that. In that story, it mentions how, because of the haste of the Mughal generals, Bidhi Chand drew these people out from the Lahore fort in a cold time of the season. They were unprepared, and they didn't prepare their guns, these matchlock rifles. So there's quite a technical explanation as well as to why the Mughal guns were not quickly able to become ready and equipped so they could fire. but the author has thrown in mythological information as well. But there is other ways to understand that, and just because that there, we shouldn't cut that out. That just requires us to dig deeper, to think harder about what is the author trying to convey here. Perhaps there's like a meta truth that's imbued in that narrative as well. So it's those type of analogies and metaphors and mythology that's included that people seem to nowadays be uncomfortable with, to the extent that the SGPC, the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandh Committee, like the major Sikh organization out of the Akal Takht in Punjab, they commissioned a revamp of Suraj Prakash. So they said, hey, Suraj Prakash is fine, but let's just take the axe to it and cut all the portions that we don't like. That committee never agreed upon what would be the final product. I believe the main committee member passed away during this process, so that never came to fruition. But people have been trying to do that for some time.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you. Lots of other questions. Okay, if you've got a question and you want to answer it live, put your hand up. There's a button at the bottom of your screen. So if you pop your hand up, then I'll ask you to speak. So now Hadkamal has had his hand up for quite a while, so I'm going to take you off mute, Hadkamal, and then you unmute yourself and you'll be able to speak.
Okay, cool. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So I actually kind of want to touch on something you spoke about, not exactly in the Zoom session, but I think you talked about it in a previous live session you did on Instagram. I think the question was asked in the sense that when you look at a literary work, or when scholars study literary works, do you look at the content first or the literary devices to base your interpretation off of? You kind of alluded to the fact that the state that Sikh scholars are in right now, we're not really in the position to look at any sort of linguistic devices or look at the greater context because there hasn't been enough focus put into the content. So my question is, what do you think it would take to kind of create more scholars? And in terms of learning about these historical granths and texts, do you think in studying them, one has to base their interpretation off of their own self-knowledge, or it takes learning from an ustad or some sort of sampradat to base your understanding off of?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for your question. It's a very good question. How do we basically create more scholars in this field, and how to engage with the text? How do we learn from it? Should you learn from a teacher or not? In regard to the first question, how do we create more scholars? There are like a lot of scholars out there, especially in Punjab, even the youth in UK, like I mentioned, Jvala Singh, Resham Singh out of UK, who are writing English versions of the text. There are people that have engaged with these type of writings. Braj Pasha is a language that was written not only for Suraj Prakash, but the other historical texts, like I mentioned, Guru Blas texts, even the writings associated with Guru Gobind Singh, Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, even portions of the Adi Granth, Adi Guru Granth Sahib, like the writings of Guru Tegh Bahadur. These are written in Braj as well, and people are engaging with this text. I think one of the main things that needs to change, though, you can study Braj grammar, vocab, and the poetic devices, and that's very important, and that's the foundation of one's learning. But it's also really the approach one takes. So like I said, people like Oleg have translated the text largely, not fully, but it's because of their approach. It kind of limits the access to the text, and it kind of stains a lot of their work as well. So I think, having the right approach to the text is important. And that's what, when we talk about how do we create more scholars, first, I think, language learning should be there. Language learning should be there. And then obviously there's a hierarchy in how you learn language, vocab, grammar, the poetic devices, and, all of that type of the more fancier stuff that comes later after learning all of that. Like people who know the language and the grammar of Braj, only those people would even appreciate, the sophistication of Santokh Singh's writings, which are insanely sophisticated. Largely Western academia has not had the access to them yet, but it's very impressive, the work that Santokh Singh has done. So in regard to the second question of how do you learn this text, or these types of texts, it's interesting because Western academia has one approach, and have been fortunate to spend time in India as well, and to see that side of approach, learning from a samprada, learning from a teacher there. They're quite different, and not all approaches work for the same for all people. The approach in India is, you study under a teacher for many years, and slowly through assimilation and through their structured approach, knowing, and through that approach, that slowly you get to understand the knowledge by swimming in it, basically. Like, you're constantly looking at those types of texts, you're constantly having to explain those texts. Even the language you use in common day uses those idioms and uses those ideas. It's a very different way of learning. And in fact, it's hard to say which one's better, but definitely if you live and you swim in it, it becomes second nature. The teaching in Western academia is important as well, and it works for the students or the Sikh diaspora who have grown up in Western countries. But to learn a text, or to learn texts like these, would require extensive time learning vocab, grammar, and then the poetic devices. So it is quite a lengthy process, and this is why it's inaccessible, because people have not had the opportunity to take those years. It takes years to produce scholars who can translate information, and then it requires the scholar's effort, the student's effort in learning, and it also requires the community's effort in supporting that. Like I mentioned patronage before, it was through that time in Ranjit Singh's era, all these monarchs were supporting poets, supporting writers, supporting scholars, that the foundation of the Sikh community, the literary community, was established. Because in the 18th century, in the 1700s, Sikhs were it was quite a difficult time for Sikhs. So not many were able to write extensively as they did in the early 19th century. So it's a reciprocal thing. It requires both students to learn, and it requires the community to support those students. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, totally. Just, I guess, just tacking on like last thing, if there was enough community support, would you ever consider doing this full time, or kind of working as a scholar in that sense?
Well, it should be noted, I am a full-time student at this point, but and I did want to preface at the start of the presentation is that I am still a student. I've not completed this dissertation on the Suraj Prakash. So I am taking suggestions, I am taking information and critique as well about the direction that I'm going with this research. But yeah, I do hope to, and I plan to continue in this field as long as I can, full time.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to unmute Ramandeep now, because I think you've also got a question which a lot of people are interested in. So Ramandeep, over to you.
Hi, Jvala Singh. Great presentation. My question is that in the Taksal, it's commonly known or explained that there was, along with Kavi Santokh Singh, there was about 13 other Brahmins who were also commissioned to edit the final version of the Suraj Prakash. And that was basically done by the benefacting Raja who commissioned the works. You didn't mention this. Is this something that you have come across as well?
That's actually a point I've never either heard, having spent time under scholars who have studied from the Taksal, and also that's never something I've come into. I've never seen across textually any reference in regard to that. So if you do have those references, that would be useful in my research, but that's not something I've ever come across or heard.
Because that seems to be the root cause of the I guess the things that are controversial in the Suraj Prakash, things that have been, what we believe have been put in on purpose with malicious intent, and hence in the traditional method of doing the Katha for Suraj Prakash, from the Damdami Taksal at least, those portions are missed. Like you mentioned, Kavi Santokh Singh, Bhai Veer Singh decided to miss certain things so that he believed that wouldn't have been or were not relevant to our Guru Sahib's Jeevan. But that tradition carries on now. So any Taksali Singh who does a katha for Suraj Prakash, there are elements that he will not essentially mention, so skip, if you like. So it's interesting that you haven't come across that, but definitely that is something that in the Taksal is commonly kind of like discussed and well, I guess shared.
It's interesting, interpretations on the reasons why Santokh Singh, written what he, what's there in the text, differs quite a bit. People say, all sorts of things, and without any textual reference, without any, actual factual evidence to point to that, I would be extremely skeptical. Having studied under somebody from, this lineage of the Taksal, Gyani Inderjit Singh from Raqba, he is somebody that maintains that that this text was not edited and that this text should be read as it is. And you can find his discourse on gurmatvichar.com regarding the text. And what he does, while other people may shy away from certain portions of the text, he is somebody that faces it head on and provides context as to maybe why Santokh Singh wrote what he did. And so I would say that's not widespread within the Taksal, and perhaps there are students of the Taksal that do that, but yeah, I don't think that's
one of the biggest controversies then is the whole episode about Vaisakhi, right? About the Panj Pyare, in the Suraj Prakash, it's written the goats were sacrificed, right? I mean, that's totally controversial. How you can't? Yeah, I don't think anyone can justify that.
No, this is an amazing question, because it kind of shows why, and it shows kind of the reaction that Suraj Prakash gets at times. So what Ramandeep Singh is mentioning here is that in the Suraj Prakash, when it describes the story of the first Amrit Sanchar that happened on Vaisakhi, Anandpur Sahib, 1699, that story, Guru Gobind Singh's story, it mentions in the Suraj Prakash that there was goats there was a tent there, and in modern day, the modern day sensibility, the modern day story is that, that could never have happened. And what I want to do through the podcast, through illuminating some of these historical texts which have not been translated into English, is to show that historical sources, not only in regard to this story but in other stories, perhaps they have a different view on what happened. And we can show that, for example, Amandeep was talking about intertextual links. This story is also mentioned by Kaur Singh in Jvala Singh Dasmi, 1751, a very, very early text. It's mentioned in Jvala Singh Dasmi, so Kaur Singh, 1797. So when a modern listener like yourself is listening to these stories, they have to maybe perhaps think, where have I got these stories from? I've heard the story about Vaisakhi. People have told it to me in a Gurdwara that there was no tent, but upon what are they basing that information on? And that's the question I really want to get out during this podcast, is that I think, and I've seen, quite a reaction to the podcast. The podcast is up to 40,000 plays now, and people have been shooting messages about this is what we as youth want. We want source-based Sikh history, because for too long people can tell stories and they can tell their stories out of devotion, but if they're not rooted in anything historical, then it becomes problematic over time, which is what we're seeing today.
I'd like to share some references for that, textual references as well, perhaps offline, but by Jetaji, he covered this in his diary about the Amrit Sanchar that took place.
Actually,
Also,
Randy, why don't you do that? Let's because often with these talks, what we've done is they've gone on to social media and they've been really interesting conversations. So pick that up. Are you on Twitter, by the way?
sorry, on what?
On Twitter.
Twitter. No, I've got an account, but I need to react.
Drop me a note after this, and let's carry this on offline because I think that would be really good. Actually, it's been a really good conversation that you prompted there, but I do want to get to some of the others as well. So if you don't mind,
sure, yep.
I'll do that. But thanks very much for that. That's really good. It's always good to get a bit of get a lively discussion around that. So thank you. Put you on mute. Let's go to Suraj Singh. Hopefully you're still there. I'll take you off. Ask you to ask a question.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So my question is basically in three parts actually. So is it fine if I ask all of them at one go, or should I ask one by one?
Ask them all at once, and then.
Yeah.
But Jvala, don't. If it's a long answer, then let's go to some of those Q&As because there's lots there as well. So be select.
Okay, sure. So first is quite basic. It's about what modern day resources do we have to learn poetic measures and vocabulary, grammar about Braj Bhasha. Of my experience so far with anything with any language like Hindi, Urdu, Sudokri, Punjabi, the best thing is to read, and then you gain an understanding by also reading the translation. Sorry. And then the next one is about the evolution of languages, basically. So Pella, like we had Sanskrit, we moved to Avadi, then we went to Gurbani and Sudokri, now to Braj Bhasha, then to Punjabi with Bhai Veer Singh. So what do you see what do you see happening in the future? Do you think we'll go back to Braj, or where will it swing to? And the last thing is about the understanding. So even in Gurbani, we get examples that you need to be sort of familiar with the culture, with some tuks that come, and then only do you have a better understanding of what they're trying to say. Is that relevant to understanding Braj and Suraj Prakash as well?
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for your questions. Thanks for tuning in. In regard to modern sources to learning Braj and the poetic meters and all that, Pandit Kartar Singh Dhaka has written a great book, Guru Kavya Darshan. It's worth checking out. If Amandeep says, this is going to go to a written thing on Twitter, I can provide images of these books. So Kartar Singh Dhaka has written on this. Also, Khan Singh Nabha has written on this, poetic meters. Those are modern sources of which one can understand poetic meters used in Braj and essentially used in Gurbani as well. I believe somebody sent me, there's an English course coming out or is out by people in Malaysia. I'm not sure, but if you Google around, you can find something related to that. I don't think there's anything out there yet beyond that in English, but Dhaka's work in Punjabi and Khan Singh Nabha's work is very good. Evolution of languages, yeah, quite right, that over time, language changed. People started using different language. The language used in the Guru Bilas era is quite different than what Guru Nanak was writing in. Is that a problem? Language changes over time according to the audience. What does the future hold? If you can look at us right now, we're speaking in English. And I think, English is a language that has taken over the world in a way that no other language has. Prior to this, if we talk about the rise of Braj, which the late Alison Bush did so eloquently in her book, Poetry of Kings, she talks about how there was like this Braj cosmopolitan, like this Braj culture that kind of proliferated all areas in North India. It wasn't strictly a Sikh language. It was a language that poets and scholars were writing in across communities that people would engage in. Which is essentially what's happening now in English. Like everybody's writing in English. I think what would need to happen as a minimum for the Sikh diasporic community is that you have scholars who are quite equipped in English, as well as quite equipped in Braj and some of these other languages that are utilizing Gurbani, such that they can transmit that information, because kids are growing up with English being their first language here. So it makes sense to provide them access to that. And the reception that we've seen from the Suraj podcast is clearly shows that people are demanding that some of the stories be put into English. So I think that will answer the future question in relating to Gurbani culture. You're quite right as well that to understand Gurbani, it doesn't come out of a vacuum. It was written in a specific time. It mentions things of that time, which perhaps don't exist today. It mentions ideas, idioms, proverbs of the time. And it is quite useful, very important to know that in understanding Gurbani. In regard to the historical text, exact same thing. How to do that requires, I guess, commentators of the text to write upon it, to explain that, this idea had been utilized in such a way, this idiom had been utilized in such a way. This is why, one of my first undertakings was to dive into Proverbs, is that because when I was translating some of these texts, I found it difficult to translate a proverb without looking that up. It's like, how do you translate some of these proverbs literally? It doesn't make sense in the context of the story. Well, obviously, because it's not meant to be taken literally. It's alluding to something else. So it just requires scholars to dig deeper in their efforts to, shine light on these texts. So, yeah, absolutely, it's 100% required.
Good questions. Great questions. There's a few more language questions as well. So, tell me about Braj. Is it a spoken language, or is it just a literary language? That's
it was literally, it was performed as well. It's a very performative language. So these writings, nowadays when we encounter some of these writings, everybody thinks that everybody was sitting down with a text. Right. In that culture, it's quite rare to have text in front of you. You were quite a privileged person to have a book, a poti, with written Gurbani in it. It was something that was performed, and there was music, there was sounds associated with it. It was very performative, and thus there was like rhythms to it. There was a chal to how you say different meters. Not spoken in the sense that how Punjabi is spoken, but in the sense that it was used for poetry, it was used to write linguistic device books, it was used to write even Ayurvedic books, so medicine books. It was used to write all sorts of different things, but how it would be written, it would be written in meters and poetry and such. So.
And what motivated you to do it? What's been your personal journey?
My personal journey has been through primarily through the writings of Guru Jvala Singh, who writes in Braj, and then having spent time with people that do katha of Suraj Prakash on the daily. It was just around at all times, and it was something that I found. This text is fantastic. It's just wild. When you start reading some of these stories, you had no idea that people could be this detailed in a text, some 200 years ago. And it's just quite different. Like Ramandeep brought up, like, how could this be? I had the same approach. I was like, wow, this is wild. How could this be? But I think the approach is what matters. If you approach it with some type of, I would say in generally, all of us should take an approach where it's based in humility. It's like if you don't understand it, if you're questioning why this text is writing this specific, using this perhaps idea or using this idiom, maybe we should try harder to understand why is it saying that, as opposed to saying just outright that this is it's not something that should be written. So for me, it was just something that was around. And within these traditional learning institutions, this text holds a significant importance within the Taksals, the Udasis, Nirmalas, etc.
All right, you make it sound really casual. Look, we've got a few minutes left until we get to past, which is when I normally stop this. So let's, why don't you take on the Q&A, why don't you scan through and look at some questions that you haven't answered. The biggest one is, sorry, the next one up is how reliable is Suraj Prakash? But I think you've tackled that really, haven't you? You talked about inconsistencies. Amrik's question is about the Leitner. I don't know if you've got anything more to say on that with his specific question.
I mean, Leitner is quite a massive text, and I think it's not a text that I've gone through page by page yet. It is just he's done like a life's work of the survey, so I can't really speak to that.
Another time we're going to have to tackle that with somebody else, right? V's question is about can you tell the patron from the writings? Can you tell that it came from the court, Padiala or Jeans or whatever?
Yeah. So in Suraj Prakash, he does mention Uday Singh being the supporter, and how Uday Singh actually brings him to Kathal, brings Santokh Singh to Kathal to write this story. So, quite embedded in the text. Santokh Singh mentions Uday Singh's name, mentions why he brought him there, what his role is there to write this massive text. So yes, you can, usually in these types of texts, you can identify who the patron is.
Okay, super. Are there any other questions that have caught your eye? Tough thing to ask, isn't it? There was a nice question from
Gurpreet Singh says, can we have a bibliography of the text you mentioned? Absolutely. I don't know if I should send that to you, Amandeep, or I'll post it on Twitter. We'll figure a way to do that.
Send it to me. There's an email that goes out in 24 hours time, so we can put in anything that we need into that.
And largely these texts, like I mentioned, Leitner's, that's available online. Ganesha Das, if you do some Googling, that's available online. So these texts are available online. Like the others I mentioned, I'll provide a link to the Bhai Gurdas Education Trust out of England, who's providing English translations of the stories of Guru Nanak. I'll provide the link to the podcast, all that information. I'll send to you, Amandeep, and then you can send it out.
All right. So let's take this as a final question, because I think it's a good one that sort of talks about where it is now. Why it said it was endorsed by both Singh Sabha groups, but why do you think it was never brought out into the mainstream after this? Why has it not been translated before? Now, you did touch on that a little bit, but...
So primarily, I think the reason is language difficulty. So even when Bir Singh publishes it, early 20th century, I think 1935 is when he publishes it for the second time. He provides footnotes in there. The language is quite difficult. People do write commentaries of it after the fact. People like, Oleg has written one. I believe there's one or two other ones as well. The author's name, I forget. But one of the large reasons is this text is massive. So it's a lot easier to read 200-300 pages of the history of Sikhs in general is a daunting task for many people who, are somewhat engaged with Sikh tradition. To read, a bookshelf of just one guru, this is a lifetime of work to read, let alone to, engage with and to provide secondary sources, and all that extra fancy jazz that people need to do in the scholarly world. I would say just the sheer amount and also the politics associated with it. For example, you have stories like people saying, Ramandeep mentioned that to me. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I've heard other stories that, this text has been altered and changed in some way, but people, the more they engage with the text, I think they'll be shocked as to clearing up misconceptions. So one of the misconceptions is like, this whole text is just bigging up Hindu mythology and Hindu philosophy, if we could even understand that as a term, which would be difficult. But in the text, Santokh Singh is quite clear, and I put translations of this on manglacharan.com, that he says, there's one very touching line that he puts in there, that he's like, people have talked about Ram and people have talked about Krishna, and scholars of the world know that they've done great things, and people know that, but he's like, from my opinion, pound for pound, there's nobody greater than Guru Gobind Singh. And he's quite honest about his praise about the Gurus. And I think once people engage more with the text, a lot of these misconceptions about, oh, this is just Brahmanvad or this or that, what Khan Singh Nabha wrote is that, so Khan Singh Nabha, if anybody knows, he wrote this, he organized the writing of this Mahan Kosh, this great dictionary that most people use nowadays, in the early 20th century. In the footnote for Santokh Singh, he writes that Santokh Singh was a great scholar. He was a devotee of the Gurus, 100%. He was an amazing person, basically. But as a result of his education, these Brahmanical ideas seeped into his writings. So he doesn't slight Ibn Santokh Singh at all. He just says, what he was writing was a result of the context of his time in which he was writing. And that's true for everybody, including Ibn Khan Singh himself, for him to write that, which we should be aware about as well. It was during Khan Singh Nabha's time that there was this split within the community that anything that didn't appear kosher, that was considered Brahmanvad. So that context is also important to know.
Thank you. Wow, what an answer. Look, once again, I find myself reminding myself that the only thing I really truly know is how little I actually know, because this has been so phenomenally educational. So thank you very much. Wonderful stuff, really illuminating. Thank you. We're honored. You said you were honored to be on it, but we are honored to have heard from you, for you to share your knowledge with us today. So thank you very much indeed for that. And look, just for everyone else that's on the line right now, that if you take Suraj Prakash as this phenomenal piece of work, it's a product of two things. As Jvala said, it's a product of a scholar, it's a product of a patron as well. And right now there are still scholars around. We've just been in the presence of a phenomenal scholar for the last hour and a half. There are very few patrons around. So tomorrow when you'll get an email, you'll also get a link to this Patreon page, which Jvala is using to try to crowdfund a range of translations and that he's doing, including Suraj Prakash. And it's just it's a scandal. It's a scandal, really, that something that's as important as this is not accessible to us. You can get a bit of access to it via the podcast, which has been wonderful for me. But really, it needs something much more long-lasting. And I think this is the man to do it. Someone to watch, but he'll only do it with our support. So please look out for that link. Jvala, from me, from the team, from everyone who attended today, and there were many, many people that attended, thank you very much indeed for your time, for your scholarship, for your generosity.
No, thank you for having me. Like I said, it's an honor, and I look forward to seeing the future talks as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.